everyone. Welcome back to the Good Doctor's continuing coverage of the podcast And Nothing Less. Today is episode 6, Southern Discomfort. I am Dr. Kristen.
As ever, Dr. Aaron.
And this is a real nuts and boltsy episode of exactly how the 19th got passed. And so it wasn't quite as edge of your seat engaging as some of the others, perhaps, but there are some really important points that were drawn out no matter what. And we want to hit a couple of those for sure. And the first is the overall realization that we have come to. The entire history of America comes down to states' rights and racism.
States' rights and racism. And shout out to Retta for commenting that, it came down to states' rights and racism on particularly moving the 19th Amendment forward. And as soon as she said it, I literally paused the podcast and was like, and I wrote the history of the American South, but it really is the history of America. States can be explained usually by states' rights and racism.
And, there's a lot of more nuances to that. For some things, I'm sure a lot of you are going to come at us and tell us the other things. We know there's nuances. We get it. This is a little bit of a crass generalization. But if you're not introducing states' rights and racism into a historical analysis, you're probably missing a trick. Let's just say it that way.
And I think that's a really good way to phrase it. You cannot look at anything in our history without those two pieces.
Yeah, especially as we'll see in the next episode, post the 19th Amendment, how suffrage was handled and what that I'm assuming that's what we're doing because that has to be what the next episode is post-suffrage.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming. And we're going to hear a lot more about race because then that became even more of a public division than the rumblings that had been before. So that I appreciated the reminder, I should say, that lynching is essentially an act of terrorism. Mm-hmm. The lynching itself, and it was the main method of Jim Crow enforcement, and that the lynching as a definition is not just Black people being hung.
Right.
Which is a thing we had to relearn this year, actually, because we thought that was the word. Lynching is mob violence, pretty much against anybody.
Yeah.
But mostly against minorities.
Extrajudicial killing.
Extrajudicial killing. So in John Leguizamo's History for Morons, he talks about the fact that there were quite a lot of Mexican Americans and Latinx people that have been lynched throughout the history of the United States, specifically during the Civil Rights Movement. And that remember as well that Jim Crow was primarily about keeping Black people in their place, using the giantest of air quotes.
Yeah.
But it was also about punishing anybody who was sympathetic or different in any way, shape, or form. And if that sounds a lot like another regime across the ocean, there's a lot of similarities, I can't lie. So any movement that is designed to separate people and subjugate one people over another is going to share similarities. That's that life.
Yes, when human beings subjugate and oppress other human beings, it ends up looking very similar, which is an important thing to remember. And I liked how they drew out the point of the relational trauma of lynching and of that particular type of violence, and how impactful obviously it was on people like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell. That even if you don't experience that violence, there is still generational trauma. And we're seeing that as relational trauma in this episode, and then generational trauma now when we see things like the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery, and the generational trauma that exists within Black and brown bodies in relation to that type of violence. So it was an important point for them to tease out just a little bit with talking about our beloved Ida B. Wells and Mary Church.
And the other thing too is to remember that a huge goal for a lot of people was to shrink suffrage. Mm-hmm. And not to expand it. And there's a lot of movements honestly, that's still the goal of a lot of people. There's the goal of a lot of activists in one particular political persuasion is to restrict access to the ballot box. They want to restrict suffrage for any number of reasons, some of whom are blatantly racist, some of whom are blatantly sexist. some of which, I should say, not whom, their ideas are these, some of which are much more latent or seditious and hard to parse. And they hide behind language that is difficult to fully understand. But there is a large movement of people, not only in the United States, but around the world, that are trying to limit suffrage. And then there's a much, I will say, statistically larger, but not potentially as politically powerful group that is seeking to continually expand suffrage. And how do we keep access to a voting box around the world?
Mm-hmm.
In any democracy or a republic, in anything that exists I would be remiss to say that we are the only country that is still debating voting rights. That's remiss not to say, I should say. There are lots and lots of countries around the world where casting a ballot is someone's dream, and that dream has not yet been achieved. And there are people in the United States that dream of it, not just because they're young, but because they've been disenfranchised in some way. And so that tension of expanding or restricting suffrage is a current one as well.
Yeah.
And I also appreciated how blatant that the podcast was, because this is completely true. You read any history of the 19th Amendment, the only way that they got the vote was if the suffragists promised that Black women wouldn't get it too.
Yeah, and they talk about that several times throughout various episodes in this podcast, but obviously once you get to the last waning years of the push for the ratification of the 19th, it becomes more and more clear. We get the passage of Jim Crow laws in the South. We get the restrictions of citizenship placed on Asian women and Indigenous women. But
Asian people and Indigenous people, that is not just gendered.
Yes, yeah. Not just gendered. And I think one of the things that I enjoyed from this whole series and this episode specifically was the reminder that there were multiple perspectives and diverse perspectives within these movements. And you had all these different organizations and leaders, Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul and Susan B. Anthony until she passed, like coming
and Josephine
Pearson, yeah, who was the Phyllis we talked about. If you watched our Mrs. America coverage, Josephine Pearson, clearly the Phyllis Schlafly of this part.
Yeah, except that movement. I think Josephine Pearson believed her convictions to the core of her bones, and I'm still not convinced that Phyllis Schlafly ever did.
No, Phyllis Schlafly.
Josephine Pearson, she believed in temperance and Jesus. She definitely did. So
yeah. But that was a really interesting part of this episode too. And I know you've read A Women's Hour by Elaine Weiss, and I haven't yet, so you know a lot more about Josephine Pearson. So
I look forward to you joining me in that knowledge.
I look forward to it as well. It was great to have Elaine Weiss along with us on this journey. But yeah, and the importance that almost movements need to be diverse, and there needs to be multiple perspectives. Because we certainly teach history as unifying. We look back at suffrage as these women fought for the right to vote. And we've, throughout this whole series, we've talked about the process of mythologizing what happened and who was significant to this movement in the way that we remember and teach this history. So again, every time this podcast chips away at that mythology, it's valuable for all of us to hear and to say, like, no, in order to get even just the 19th across the line, we had to have these different voices and these multiple perspectives. And it was a movement in some ways unified for the goal of suffrage, but not in the way to get there and not in who got that suffrage. And I don't think can't be overstated. And I know we've talked about it in previous videos, but we're talking about it again today because it was important.
So there's a difference too, when we talk from a leadership perspective about unification of purpose versus unification of tactics and unification of ideas. There's a really popular biblical phrase that has become almost lexiconical in America, which is that iron sharpens iron. That comes from, I believe, Ecclesiastes or Proverbs, one of the two, but it's an Old Testament proverb. And it's really true. Like, you really need people to disagree with you around you. And there's a great argument to be made about the Occupy Wall Street from an organizational movement perspective,
Right.
they actually didn't have a lot of people within them who disagreed, and so they weren't really ready for criticism. They weren't ready, not even just for ideological criticism, but for organizational structure criticism. They just didn't have a lot of dissenting voices. And like, you have to be really careful. There's a difference between dissent, like a Supreme Court level dissent,
Yeah.
and then a dissent that's a toxic presence. You want a Supreme Court kind of dissent within your organization.
Yeah.
Don't want toxicity. So it's a balance. We're not saying it's not.
Yeah. And there's a real difference between dissent and opposition as well, which
yes,
same thing. Yeah.
But nearly every successful global change movement has involved dissent within the ranks.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them have actually involved opposition externally as well.
Yeah.
And we have to fight in that way, because, I mean, just to be completely frank, no one knows what we're doing. Really? Like, we're all figuring this out as we go along. And anyone who tells you differently is selling something, literally.
Something. Thank you, Princess Bride. Yeah.
And we're all just kind of fumbling our way towards whatever a better planet looks like to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need people who have different visions of that planet. You need people who don't care at all. I actually believe that we need to be engaging with apathy a little bit more than we are, so that we understand why people don't care. That's a separate soapbox for another time. But this is really important. I was taught that suffrage was all women against all men.
Uh-huh.
And that has that shaped my early feminism in a very negative way.
Mm-hmm.
We have got to stop the monolithic narrative of both feminism and suffrage.
100%. I can't say it better, and I totally agree because obviously we're the same age, and so we grew up with the same version of history that was taught to us, and it 100% negatively impacted my understandings of feminism, and the complex relationship,
mm-hmm.
And narratives and structures and human beings that were involved in the women's movement, which was not just about suffrage either. Nor
was it entirely about abortion,
right.
Which is what I was taught growing up.
Yeah, and so we've done a lot of damage, and now is the time to unpack it, I think, and especially we'll talk more next episode kind of about the future, but also the benefit of commemorative exercises and how this whole process of re-examining these narratives is a good thing, and we should do it all the time, not just when anniversaries come up.
Correct. And if you are like us and your COVID is full of some free time, we don't have kids, I don't have pets, we don't have plants, there's a lot of more free time for us, and it has been an interesting time for a lot of these centenaries to come along, because we've gotten to take the opportunity to really deep dive and unpack a lot of what we've learned. Mm-hmm. And that has become a bit of a coping mechanism for both of us, in a way, which we respect is not the same for other people. So if you're watching this in 2025, welcome. We got to learn when we got to learn, but there is the process of education is unlearning what you already know and relearning a deeper version. Mm-hmm. And that is one that we hope you're all embarking on. And if you're not, we're not quite sure why you're spending your time with us, because time
especially at the end of this video.
Just thanks for joining us.
Yeah. So we look forward to joining you guys, hopefully, for episode 7 next week, and we'll have some comprehensive and final thoughts about where we go from here.
Absolutely. See you then.
Bye.
Bye.